The guests would later say they saw it happen in his eyes first. That slow, stunned widening, that sharp, ice-cold shift from confusion to pure, murderous certainty. It was supposed to be the happiest day of his son's life, a wedding wrapped in flowers, families, and whispered promises beneath soft lights. But the moment the bride stepped onto the altar, the father didn't see love, he saw a lie. He rose to his feet, trembling, whispering words no one around him could hear. His son reached for him. The bride froze. And within the next 60 seconds, that room of celebration would transform into a crime scene. A secret, buried for years, was about to break through the surface at the worst possible moment, because just before the ceremony, the father received a message that confirmed everything he feared. A message that said, "She isn't who you think she is." What he did next would leave a bride dead, a groom destroyed, and an entire community stunned. This is the wedding that ended in murder.
When the first officer stepped into the hall, he stopped at the doorway as if the room itself had warned him not to enter. The screams had faded into sobs, the decorations were scattered, and in the center, a bride in a white gown lay still on the floor. Daniel refused to move from her side. His suit was stained. His hands were shaking. He kept asking her to breathe, as if the force of his voice alone could pull her back. Harold stood a few feet away, silent, his hands raised, his expression empty, like a man who had already accepted the price of what he'd done. Officers moved carefully toward him, while another knelt beside the bride, checking for signs of life. There were none. A paramedic called the time, and the words echoed through the hall like a hammer dropped on glass. Daniel broke. He screamed her name, his voice cracking as he tried to lift her, begging anyone to help him. But no one could. The pastor stepped back in shock. Guests covered their mouths, some looking away, others staring without blinking. And Harold didn't shed a tear. The lead officer approached him slowly. "Sir, you need to come with us." Harold nodded once. No argument, no resistance. He handed over the phone again, as if that device explained everything. The officer glanced at the screen, a message still open, a name highlighted, a photo attached. Whatever he saw made his eyebrows tighten. He called a second officer over, then a third. And in that moment, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a simple arrest. The bride wasn't just dead. She wasn't just a victim. There was something else, something the bride had hidden, something Harold believed justified everything he did. And when officers pulled Daniel away from her body, he finally asked the question that everyone had been thinking, but no one had dared to say out loud. "What did you do to her, and why?"
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.
By the time I arrived, the chaos had settled into a different kind of silence. The kind that tells you whatever happened wasn't an accident. The bride was already covered. The groom was on the floor, refusing to speak. And the father, Harold Benton, sat against the wall with the calm of a man who believed he had done the right thing. But the phone he kept handing to every officer who approached him, that was the first red flag. A message, a name, a warning. and one line that told me this was not simple rage. This was something premeditated.
The detective Harris studied the message again. A short text, sent minutes before the ceremony. No greeting, no explanation. Just 5 words. Check her identity. Trust nothing. Attached was a document, one that contradicted everything the bride had told Daniel since the day they met. As officers restrained Harold, the detective instructed them not to move him far. Not yet. Something about the message, something about the timing, something about the look on Harold's face told the detective this case was bigger than what the guests had witnessed. Meanwhile, Daniel could barely stand. He kept asking for answers, begging someone to explain what his father meant. But no one spoke. The detective approached him slowly, knowing the truth would crush him long before the investigation even began. Daniel, there's something you need to see.
Daniel wiped his face, still trembling. What did my father find? The detective hesitated, because the truth was brutal. The bride wasn't who she said she was, and the identity she spent years hiding was the same identity Harold believed would destroy his son's life.
Chaos rippled through the wedding hall, but it didn't start with the scream or the crash or the gunshot. It started with a whisper. Security had barely restrained the father when something strange happened, something almost no one noticed amid the confusion. The groom's best man suddenly stepped back. His face drained of color, his eyes locked on the bride, not with shock, but with recognition. And in that split second, the story took a darker turn. Because while guests gathered around the shaken groom, while the bride trembled near the aisle, while the father tried desperately to break free, the best man leaned forward and spoke only 2 words. "It's her." The bride froze, her breathing shattered. She knew instantly what he meant. Before the groom could process anything, the best man quietly pulled him aside, forcing him further away from his father, and whispered something into his ear, something that made the groom's knees nearly buckle. The groom's voice cracked. "Are you sure?" The best man nodded, eyes full of a fear deeper than the chaos around them. And just like that, everything the groom believed about the woman he was about to marry began to unravel. The bride tried to approach him, tried to speak, tried to explain, but the groom stepped back, hands shaking, eyes filling with a new kind of terror. Then, before anyone could stop it, the bride blurted out the words that shifted the entire ceremony from confusion to devastation. "Let me explain. It's not what you think. I was going to tell you after the vows." The groom flinched as if struck. Guests gasped. The father, hearing those words, broke into a scream and tore against the security holding him, his rage exploding even more violently than moments before. And right there, in the middle of the ruined ceremony, the truth detonated. The bride had not always been the woman standing before them, and the groom had been the last to know. This was no longer a wedding. It was the unraveling of a secret that had been buried for years, and the ignition point of the violence that would soon follow.
The moment the bride admitted she had been planning to reveal the truth after the vows, the room broke into 2 worlds. One frozen in silence, the other erupting in disbelief. The groom's face drained completely. His hands trembled as he stared at her, almost as if he didn't recognize the person standing there in the wedding gown. He stepped forward, voice cracking. Tell me now, what are they talking about?" The bride swallowed hard, tears spilling, her voice barely holding together. "I was born male, but I transitioned years ago.
I didn't hide it because I wanted to deceive you. I was scared. I thought after we married, we'd talk through it together." The groom's chest rose and fell rapidly. He looked around the room, at his guests whispering, at his mother crying, at his father being held down by security, and suddenly everything felt like a trap closing around him. His father shouted from across the aisle, voice raw. "I warned you she wasn't who she claimed, and you called me crazy. Look at you now! Look!" Security tightened their grip on him as he fought to break loose again. But the groom wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were locked only on the bride. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning? Why not before I proposed, before I brought you home, before today?" The bride tried to step toward him, hands shaking. "Because I loved you, because I didn't want to lose you." But the groom stepped back, then another step, then another. And with every step he took away, the father's rage grew louder, fueling the tension, tightening the air. One of the bridesmaids suddenly shouted, "This isn't the place for this! Everyone calm down!" But it was too late. The groom's mother collapsed into a chair, sobbing. Guests argued. Phones came out. Some recorded, some prayed. And the bride, still standing in the middle of the aisle, began to break down completely, realizing that everything she had tried to protect was falling apart in front of her. But within that emotional collapse came something else, a detail, a name that slipped from the crowd and changed everything. From the back of the hall, someone whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. "Isn't she the same person from that case years ago? The one with the restraining order?" The bride's head snapped toward the voice, eyes wide, terrified. Because the secret she had been hiding was even bigger than the groom could imagine. And the mention of that name, that case, sent the groom's father into a level of rage that pushed the night towards its fatal outcome. The moment that voice from the back mentioned a case, the atmosphere inside the hall shifted again. This time, not with confusion, but with fear. The groom turned sharply. "What case? What are you talking about?" But the bride didn't turn at all. She just closed her eyes, slowly, like someone bracing for a blow she'd spent years outrunning. Murmurs spread through the guests like a wave. A bridesmaid choked back a gasp. The groom's mother covered her mouth, trembling. And then another voice, this time louder, more certain, cut through the chaos. "She used to go by another name. I remember. There was a scandal. Police involved." The groom's father heard it. His breathing turned harsh, fast, violent. Pinned down by security, he shouted across the room, "Tell my son the truth, all of it, or I swear to God!" Security forced him back into the chair, but his fury kept burning through every word. The groom stepped closer to the bride, voice breaking apart. "What are they talking about? What name? What scandal? Did you lie about that too?" The bride backed away. Her fingers clutched the wedding dress. Her voice came out small, shaking. "Please, not like this. Not in front of everyone." But there was no later left. Not after the message, not after the confrontation, not after the whisper that cracked open a buried past. One of the groom's uncles, face pale, finally said what everyone else was thinking. "Son, she was involved in an incident before she transitioned. Police matter, court matter. It was quiet, but it happened." The groom stood still as stone. "Is this true?" His voice barely made it out. The bride nodded once, so faintly it barely counted as an admission. And that was the final spark. Across the room, the groom's father erupted, screaming through the restraints. I told you she was dangerous! You brought a stranger into our home!" The panic. Security tightened. Someone called for the police. Someone shouted that the wedding should be stopped immediately. And as the bride collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably, the groom said the words that shattered her completely. "I don't know who you are anymore, and I don't know if I ever did." The bride's expression changed, not to anger, not to sadness, but to something far more alarming: pure terror. Because she saw the groom's father break free from one of the guards, saw his hand reach into his coat, and knew exactly what he was about to do. She screamed, "Run!" But the groom didn't move. He didn't understand. And the father, holding the weapon everyone feared, was no longer yelling. He was aiming.
In the blink of an eye, the ceremony transformed from chaos into horror. The father lunged forward, pushing past the guards holding him back. His eyes locked on the bride, not with hate, not with grief, but with a cold, unflinching certainty that this was justice. The bride screamed. The groom shouted his father's name. Guests froze in terror. Some ducked under chairs. Some could only stare. The father pulled the weapon from his coat. One motion, swift, deadly. Screams tore through the hall as the first shot rang out. Chaos exploded around them. Guests scrambled for the exits. Panic consumed the room. The bride tried to run. The groom ran after her, but the father was faster, relentless. Every step, every motion drove the tragedy forward. In less than a minute, the sound of the shots ended. The hall fell silent, except for the sobbing, the gasps, the disbelief. The bride lay on the floor, motionless. The groom knelt beside her, shaking uncontrollably, begging for her to wake. The father didn't flee. He didn't resist the officers who finally restrained him. He simply stood there, breathing heavily, as if he had fulfilled a mission only he could understand. The guests, frozen in shock, realized the impossible had happened. A wedding, meant to celebrate love, had become a scene of murder. And as the first responders secured the room, one question hung in the air, one that would follow everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Why?
When we arrived at the scene, the hall was a picture of chaos frozen in time. Guests were still in shock, chairs overturned, glass shattered. And the bride? She was gone. Her life ended in the middle of the aisle. The father had been restrained, sitting quietly, almost eerily calm. The groom was beside the body, trembling, unable to comprehend what had just happened. And the message on the phone, that had triggered everything, still glowed in the father's hand. From the start, it was clear this was no ordinary crime of passion. There was premeditation, there was intent, and there was a secret behind the bride that had pushed a man over the edge.
Detectives quickly secured the scene. They photographed everything, collected evidence, and began to reconstruct the timeline. Who saw what, who said what, and what triggered the father's final action. Every detail mattered. The first piece of evidence was the phone. It contained a single message: "Check her identity before it's too late." Attached was a document that contradicted everything the bride had told the groom about her past. That document was what Harold had read just minutes before the ceremony began. Detectives interviewed the guests, the groom's family, the wedding planners, everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. The common thread was the same: shock, horror, confusion. No one could fully understand why a father would turn a wedding into a murder scene until they saw the message. From that moment, the investigation became twofold: determine the father's motives
and uncovered the truth about the bride that had been hidden for years. Little did anyone know, the secret revealed at that ceremony was only the beginning of a much larger story.
I was there that day, standing just a few steps away, watching it all unfold. Daniel, the groom, he wasn't just shocked, he was broken. The kind of broken that leaves you silent and shaking at the same time. He kept repeating the same questions over and over. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't anyone tell me? His hands were trembling so badly he couldn't hold on to the bride, even as she lay before him. He wanted to protect her, but he didn't know how. He wanted answers, but he couldn't process them. Everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and his future had been ripped apart in minutes. Daniel's collapse didn't end with tears. It was the visible shock of someone whose entire life had just been rewritten. He could barely recognize the person he had loved, and worse, he could barely recognize the father he had trusted to protect him. The bride, meanwhile, was terrified beyond comprehension. Every whispered accusation, every stare from the family, every frantic question from the groom was another blow. She realized in that moment her secret, once safely hidden, had ignited a chain reaction she could not control. The guests, still frozen, watched the tragedy unfold. The security teams tried to separate the father from the groom, but Daniel didn't want to move. He clung to the memory of the woman he thought he knew, even as the truth bled into the room around him. And as the detectives began their work, taking statements and photographing evidence, one thing became chillingly clear. This wasn't just a story about a wedding gone wrong. It was a story about secrets, deception, and the way one revelation can destroy everything in seconds.
As detectives gathered statements inside the wrecked hall, others began digging into the name whispered during the ceremony, the name the bride never wanted spoken again. It didn't take long before the truth surfaced. The bride, known publicly as Lena Brooks, had not always been Lena Brooks. Her former identity, one she had legally changed years earlier, was attached to a case from another state. A case involving a violent confrontation, a restraining order, and a disappearance that had left unanswered questions behind. The documents found on the father's phone were accurate. She had run from her past. A past filled with accusations, investigations, and a former partner who had claimed she was dangerous. But here's where the story became blurred. Nothing in that case ever resulted in a conviction. Nothing directly proved the accusations. Yet the echoes of that incident were loud enough to ruin her name, and loud enough to convince a desperate father that his son's life was in danger. Detectives retrieved the full file from the federal database. They reviewed the reports, the witness statements, the inconsistencies. There were gaps, major ones, the kind of gaps that suggested the truth had never been fully uncovered. And the most troubling detail wasn't what the bride had done, but what had been done to her. The investigation from years earlier documented threats against her, anonymous warnings, stalking behavior that she had reported but was never taken seriously. She wasn't just running from a mistake. She was running from someone. And that someone, the one who sent the father the message just before the ceremony, was still out there.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight. Detectives shifted their attention to the one thing that triggered the disaster. The anonymous message sent to the groom's father minutes before the wedding began. The number was unregistered. No name. No linked address, just a disposable line purchased 2 weeks earlier in another state. But the content of the message was chillingly precise. It included her old name, a scanned copy of the case file, photos from the incident years ago, and the warning that sealed her fate. You're about to lose your son if you don't tell him the truth. The father saw it as a threat that his son was in immediate danger. But to detectives, it felt like something else, a setup. Someone had waited for this moment, someone who knew exactly when the ceremony would begin, someone who wanted the truth to explode in public at the worst possible time. And the timing was too surgical to be coincidence. Detectives dug deeper. They sent urgent requests to telecom providers, trying to trace the source. They reviewed wedding invitation lists, vendors, employees, anyone who might have known where the family would be that day. But then a pattern emerged. The same anonymous number that messaged the father had also contacted the bride 2 days earlier, a message she never told the groom about. Those messages weren't warnings. They were threats. Photos of her old life, her old face, her old name, accompanied by one terrifying line, "I know where you're hiding." She had been living in fear long before the wedding, but she chose to keep it a secret. Detectives now understood something crucial. The person who sent those messages wasn't trying to stop the wedding, they were trying to destroy her. As detectives traced the anonymous messages, a name resurfaced from the bride's past, the same name buried inside the old case file. A man known as Victor Hale. Victor was the ex-partner tied to the incident she fled years earlier, the man who had filed accusations against her, the man she claimed had stalked her after their breakup. He was the first and only person with a documented history of targeting her. Detectives ran his name through every database available, and what they found confirmed their worst suspicion. Victor had been in the same city as the wedding, just 24 hours before the ceremony. Traffic cameras placed his car 2 blocks from the church. Hotel records showed he had checked into a room under an alias, and his phone, though switched off on the wedding day, had pinged within a mile of the venue earlier that morning. The pieces aligned too perfectly. Victor knew her old identity. Victor knew where she had moved. Victor had a history of threatening her. And Victor had every reason to sabotage her new life. Detectives immediately considered him a prime suspect, not for the shooting, but for triggering it. The theory was simple and brutal. Victor had sent the father the documents to ignite the confrontation. He had sent the bride the anonymous threats to push her into fear and silence. And by exposing her past strategically, he orchestrated the chaos that would ultimately claim her life. Detectives issued a formal request for Victor's location, but he had already vanished from the hotel, left the city, and gone offline. His disappearance, just hours after the killing, was not a coincidence. For detectives, it wasn't just a murder investigation anymore. It was a hunt for the man who may have engineered the tragedy without ever pulling the trigger.
Victor Hale wasn't just an ex-partner. He was a man with a pattern, one that repeated itself in every city he lived in. We pulled records going back nearly 8 years. Different states, different aliases, different partners. And in almost every case, there were signs of manipulation, control, and violence. Reports filed, then withdrawn.
Women who disappeared from his life suddenly. Residences abandoned overnight. Nothing ever stuck to him. Not because he was innocent, but because he knew how to disappear before the law caught up. When we saw his history lined up in sequence, one thing became clear. He wasn't just dangerous, he was calculated. The messages sent to both the bride and the father fit perfectly with his past behavior: psychological pressure, timed threats, and strategic exposure. And the worst part? He always picked moments of emotional vulnerability, moments when the damage would be irreversible. Detectives dug deeper into his movements before the wedding. He checked into his hotel 2 days prior. He requested a room with a balcony facing the road leading to the church. He purchased a burner phone at a convenience store 3 blocks away. It was the same type of device used to send the anonymous warnings. And as detectives reconstructed the timeline, an unsettling picture came into focus. Victor didn't just threaten the bride. He studied her new life. He monitored her engagement. He waited until the one moment she was most vulnerable, the moment she was about to begin a new life without him. The wedding didn't trigger him. Her happiness did. But investigators still didn't know the full truth, why Victor believed she had destroyed his life in the first place, and why he was willing to destroy hers in return.
To understand why Victor Hale haunted the bride's life for years, detectives went back to the beginning, to the first night everything between them shattered. It started with a police call in a small apartment 3 states away. A disturbance, neighbors reporting shouting, crashing furniture, and a woman crying for help. By the time officers arrived, the bride, known then by her former name, was outside the building, shaking, barefoot, with bruises forming along her arms. Victor answered the door moments later, calm, collected, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But inside the apartment, officers found the truth: broken glass, overturned chairs, and a smashed phone she had tried to use to call for help. She told officers he had trapped her in the bedroom, blocked the door, grabbed her when she tried to leave, and threatened to make sure no one else ever had her. Victor denied everything. He claimed she was unstable, dramatic, even dangerous. He said he hit her first. He said she was lying to get attention. But the police reports from that night did not match his story. Her injuries were consistent with assault. His weren't. That night was supposed to end with Victor being charged. Instead, it ended with him being released due to insufficient evidence, and her being told to stay somewhere safe for a few days. She filed a restraining order the next morning, packed her belongings into 2 suitcases, and disappeared into another city, believing she had finally escaped him. But Victor didn't stop. He followed her online, sent messages from unknown accounts, and showed up in places she thought were secret. The fear drove her to leave her entire life behind, change her name, and start over as someone new. And for years, it worked. Until the wedding. The one day she believed she was finally safe. The one moment Victor chose to strike. That was the origin of everything. The night she ran for her life, and the night Victor decided she should never escape him again. By this point, every part of Victor Hale's history painted him as the architect of the chaos. But detectives stumbled on one problem. Victor had no way of knowing the exact layout of the wedding, or the precise moment the bride would walk down the aisle, unless someone told him. The messages he sent weren't vague. They described the order of events,
the number of guests, even the seating arrangement. Information only someone attending the wedding could know. Detectives reviewed security footage from the venue. Hallways, parking lots, back entrances. That's when they noticed something strange. A guest, seated near the front rows, kept leaving the hall repeatedly in the hour before the ceremony, always stepping out to the same quiet hallway, always checking their phone, always returning with a nervous glance at the bride's side of the family. The guest's name was Maya Foster, a cousin of the groom. On paper, she had no connection to Victor, no shared addresses, no social media overlap, nothing. But detectives found something deeper. 2 months earlier, Maya had exchanged messages with an unknown number, the same unregistered line Victor later used. The conversations were short, coded, and deliberately vague, but one message stood out. "I'll do my part. You make sure she gets what she deserves." Maya's disappearance from the ceremony just minutes before the shooting made sense now. She wasn't fleeing the chaos. She was avoiding being questioned once things went wrong. Detectives realized this wasn't just a stalker resurfacing at the perfect moment. It was a coordinated plan. Victor had help. Someone inside the family. Someone with access, proximity, and motive. But the question was, why would a cousin of the groom help destroy the bride's life? The answer, when detectives uncovered it, was more personal than anyone expected. What the police expected to be a simple interrogation turned into the moment everything finally clicked into place. Hours had passed since the wedding night attack. The groom sat in a holding room, silent, shaking, refusing water, refusing comfort, repeating only one thing. "She lied to me. She lied to me." But outside that room, Detective Harris had just received the final forensic packet, a set of documents that changed the entire direction of the case. He didn't rush. He didn't celebrate. He simply read, twice. Then he walked back into the interview room and closed the door behind him. This was the moment he had been waiting for.
I looked him dead in the eye. He was expecting handcuffs, but what I had was the truth. Truth he didn't know. Truth that would have changed everything if it had come an hour earlier.
The groom stared at the detective, confused. His breathing slowed. His anger cracked just enough for fear and disbelief to push through. And then Detective Harris laid a single sheet of paper on the table. Not an indictment, not an arrest warrant, a report. A report that revealed the twist no one at that wedding saw coming.
Your bride. She didn't hide because she wanted to deceive you. She hid because she was running for her life. The groom froze, jaw clenched, eyes wide, fingers trembling. This wasn't the story he had told himself. This wasn't the betrayal he believed he saw. And in that silent moment, the real question surfaced. If she wasn't the danger, then who was?
And now, with a single revelation, the groom understood the true nightmare. The wedding night tragedy wasn't caused by betrayal. It was triggered by a stalker who had followed her into her new life, right into the ceremony, right into the moment she said, "I do." And that dangerous presence had slipped away unnoticed. The detective laid the final file on the table, but this time the room didn't explode with anger or accusation. It sank into a cold, suffocating silence. Because inside that file was the truth no one at the wedding had ever imagined. A truth that didn't excuse what happened, but shattered everything the groom thought he knew about the woman he loved. Her name in the file wasn't the name she used with him. Her address wasn't the one she gave to the wedding forms. And the photo attached was one she spent years praying no one would ever see again. For months, long before she met the groom, she had been running. Not from love, not from her identity, but from a man who had once claimed he loved her and then tried to kill her when she left him. A jealous, violent, relentless man. A man who didn't stop when she changed cities. A man who didn't stop when she changed her name. A man who followed her into that ceremony, stood among the guests, watched her walk down the aisle, and waited for the perfect moment to destroy everything she built. What the groom thought was fear of exposure was actually the bride recognizing the one person she swore she'd never see again, standing just a few rows behind her husband-to-be. Her breath caught, her steps faltered, her hands trembled around the bouquet. And when the father lifted her veil, she wasn't terrified of him. She was terrified of who she saw over his shoulder. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Someone who should have been behind bars. Someone she had a restraining order against. Someone who slipped out of the crowd the moment she collapsed to the floor. By the time the detectives arranged the reports, the truth was undeniable. This wedding was never doomed by deception. It was targeted, plotted, manipulated, hijacked by a man whose obsession turned deadly long before the ceremony began. And the father, with all his suspicion and fear and uncontrollable anger, walked right into the trap. Believing he was protecting his son from a lie, he became a weapon in someone else's revenge. He never intended to kill the bride. He reacted to a terror he believed was aimed at his family. But the timing, the chaos, the confusion, it all worked perfectly for the man who orchestrated it. In the end, the truth came late. Too late for the bride. Too late for the father. And too late for the groom whose life shattered in seconds. The stalker disappeared before police could identify him. No fingerprints, no footage, no trace. Only the bride's hidden past and the fallout of a tragedy she tried desperately to outrun. And so the case closed with a brutal, heartbreaking conclusion. A wedding meant for love became a battlefield. A father trying to protect his son became a prisoner. A groom lost the woman he loved and the father he trusted. And somewhere out in the world, the man who caused it all continues to walk free. No justice, no confession, no closure, just a single devastating truth. Sometimes the person you fear the least is the one standing closest behind you. This is how the wedding ended in murder.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.